we are turning to one of today's most urgent challenges, which is nature loss. Biodiversity is declining fast, and with it, the systems that support our food, water economy, and climate stability. The question we are exploring in this session is, how do we build a nature-positive economy and do it quickly? This is where data, finance, and policy must come together. And our panel today brings deep expertise across all three. So please help me in welcoming David Craig, Nikki Mardas, Andrew Walton, and Nicola Ranger. All right, now I want to start this conversation with David here from TNFD. Now, David, you used to be the CEO of Refinitiv, which is the competitor of Bloomberg. So what made you switch to going straight on nature data?
Yeah, so what made me switch into nature data? I've worked in financial markets for 30 years, in technology and in data, and seen how powerful they can be, how extraordinary they can be in shifting capital into the things that we all rely on. And yet, for many years, the financial markets have priced our most important asset, which is the natural system, at zero. So financial markets work well when they price risk well, when they do proper asset pricing, and yet here you have a financial market that is pricing nature at zero. So for me, this was really simple. It was, well, how do we start fixing the financial market so it's fit for the future, not the past? Because in the past, when nature was abundant, you could price it at zero. Now, nature is not as abundant. We're dependent on it for so many things. We've exploited it in so many ways. You have to put a price on nature. You have to bring nature onto the balance sheets. So, number one, make the financial system work. Number two, it's a data problem. And how do we create the right type of trustworthy, assurable, standardized data to make this work? And number three, my kids turned to me and said, what the hell are you doing about this? Because you guys are destroying the planet. So those three good reasons why I felt that actually joining TNFD, running this extraordinary group of now over 1,800 members around the world. We have over 18 trillion of assets committed to report against TNFD, moving quickly, driving fast and hard was a great calling to try and solve this problem.
So one of the things that all these panelists have in common is their focus on nature-driven data. So they all play a key part and a key role in this. So, often harming nature ends up hurting business too, and we're going to look at it later on. Basically, if you don't look at nature, you end up shooting yourself in the foot. And while many companies want to do better, they're still figuring out how to turn data into action. So my last question for you for now, David, before I pass on to the next panelist is, how does this data gathering work at TNFD, and how is it really trustworthy?
So let me reframe the question, because we often jump straight to data, right? Here's a problem, the answer is data. The answer is actually more around intelligence. So what TNFD does with the tool sets and the frameworks, and you'll hear from people like Lloyd who are using part of the framework, is it builds intelligence and understanding of my interface with nature. And that is so much more important before you jump into how do I collect lots of data, is where are my businesses located? What are the ecosystem services I depend upon? What's material, what's not material? Where have I got dependencies? Where have I got impacts? And that assessment builds knowledge, it builds understanding, and it builds intelligence around my business or my investment portfolio. So my encouragement to everyone, and I hear this question all the time, is don't jump straight to the problem being data. Don't jump straight to that. Start to build the knowledge and intelligence of your portfolio, your businesses, your operations, and really understanding your interface with nature and where those critical dependencies and impacts are. Once you've built that, TNFD then helps you create a standard data set that is uniform, that is measurable across different sectors, across different areas, and then can be much more actionable before. But again, don't jump straight to the data. Make sure you have the intelligence and knowledge to understand your businesses and your portfolios before you then look at using the standard data sets that are available.
All right. Andrew, I want to jump into you because I want to zoom in directly to the UK. You come from Lloyds Bank, and Lloyds Bank is a major player, especially with farmers. So can you give us a couple of examples where good data has helped farmers shift to more sustainable practices?
Yeah, so thanks for asking me, and thanks, Ariana, and also thanks for making me feel at home with the green branding everywhere, which for those of you that are Lloyds Bank customers, you'll appreciate. So look, we bank about 30% of UK farming, about 30% of UK farm lending, about 20% of bank accounts, and our farming customers are going out of business. And they're going out of business because of climate change. Soil degradation, biodiversity collapse in farmland is proven and enormous. And the UK is one of the worst impacted countries in the world because we've had intensive agriculture in the UK for longer than most places. So what do we as a bank have to do with that? Well, of course, we don't want our customers to go out of business. We need them to stay in business. And for them to plot a business model that gets them through to regenerative practices that can sustain yields rather than diminishing yields is the outcome, the ambition that we're working towards. And to do that, we are one of a number of players that can support farming customers in that journey. To David's point, data isn't the be-all and end-all, but it is an important jumping-off point. And so we've tried to help our farming customers by working with them and the Soil Association Exchange to produce a baseline of soil quality and some other metrics that look at biodiversity, carbon, and some other social metrics across about 250,000 hectares of the UK, covering about 700 of our farming clients. It was a big investment, very expensive piece of work, and Sachs did the most amazing, really in-depth, detailed study on each and every farm. It's different farm types, it's different parts of the country, of course it's different answers, but what we've produced is a fantastic jumping off point as a baseline to then plot what the likely regenerative gap is, what the yield gap is. Average is about 6 years, depends entirely on the type of farm. But we can now work then with food buyers and supermarkets to say, okay, so what do we need to do to finance you through that dip? And working with, I know David's involved, but the Sustainable Markets Initiative, we've actually got pilots now up and running with supermarkets and landowners to start to work out what the financial models are that can support you through that regenerative gap. That's just on the sort of, how do we support our clients who are collapsing? There's a whole load of other work we're doing as well on potentially creating third income streams for farmers, on carbon sequestration, and on biodiversity net gain credits as those markets start to emerge.
So what kind of data is actually driving the decisions here with farmers? What is the most important data that you're helping them gather?
Yeah, so the Sachs survey looks at about 6 broad areas. As you'd expect, it's looking specifically at nutrient quality, it's looking at biodiversity specifically. They count earthworms, that's a really important measure. It sounds silly, but it really isn't. So species, habitat breadth. We're obviously overlaying that with geospatial data as it's available to look at wider and wider areas. A lot of the work that people in this room are involved in is in supporting and bringing tech to play in supporting ever greater data to add to that. And then obviously traditional measures around carbon depth. And it tells you quite a lot about, relearning old lessons about types of farming, right? Guess what? Mixed farming from the 17th and 18th century turns out to be the least impactful on soil quality, and returning to mixed farming models is actually the best way to get back to regenerative practices in the round. But yes, across all of those measures. But we've also added in things like social measurements, so mental health in farm workers is actually an important measure as well. And so it looks at the whole play. And so Natural England, DEFRA, everybody is very excited about it. Sustainable Food Trust, again, a lot of people working with us to sort of say, well, what can we now do to keep the baseline growing, to add more and more to it, and to potentially learn the lessons of it across the wider farming community at a time when farming is absolutely on its knees. Yields are reducing, the weather is actually terrible for farmers for 2 years running, and soil quality just diminishes and diminishes. And I think people forget, or people think that food costs are going up because of crazy green regulations. They're not. Food costs are going up because yields are falling, and yields are falling because of climate change.
Nicola, stepping back or going directly to the finance world, you're working on building financial frameworks for nature. So I'm curious to hear how banks like Lloyd's are actually moving the needle here and are actually leading the charge, because that's an interesting topic.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think we focus on two areas, and I always think of it in terms of the size of financial flows, right? So if you look globally, around 7 trillion a year, US dollars, is flowing into things that are destroying nature. 7 trillion a year. The amount that's actually going into things that are positive for nature is only about 200 billion a year. Similar kind of balance if you look at a country like the UK. So actually, part of what we need to talk about here is how do we change those 7 trillion? How do we reduce that and hopefully make the 7 trillion the positive and make hopefully 200 billion or less the negative? So it's like, how do we change that? And I think, so, organizations like Lloyd's and other banks play a really important role in that, both through supporting their clients to look at how they can move to more sustainable practices, but then also through supporting the positive side as well. And I know Lloyd's does some great innovative work in that area. So a lot of our work is about trying to support both those sides through the data and the modeling. And part of that is geospatial data, but we also use a lot of AI, natural language processing, those sorts of techniques to look at how a company is actually performing on both those sides, and where are the opportunities for them to perform in a more positive way. And actually one of the results, and I didn't warn you about this before, Andrew, but actually one of the results from that, it shows that actually Lloyd's is one of the best performing banks on that at the moment in terms of accounting for nature related risks and putting in practices based on our independent analyses.
So you spoke mainly about Lloyd's Bank, but how are financial systems in general even equipped to handle all these nature risks?
Yeah, good question. So this is a very, very new area, I think, for the financial services. So I work on climate as well. I've worked on climate for around 20 years, and we always say we're about sort of 5 to 10 years behind on nature as where we are on climate. But we're seeing very, very, very rapid progress. And I think a lot of our lessons on climate are directly applicable to how we start thinking about nature. So what we're seeing financial firms doing, particularly in the UK, but around the world, Europe is one of the leaders in this area as well, is starting to think about, how do we measure these risks? How do we use data to look at these risks and understand our impacts? Starting to think about how do we use scenarios of what the future might look like to guide our asset allocations, our lending practices, and then thinking about how to build that into business strategy. So we're sort of seeing that progression, and that's sort of similar to what we saw on climate. And then I think within the next year or so, and actually even sooner that, we can start to see then hopefully the financial flows switching towards more the positive. But certainly what we're seeing on nature is the progress is much faster than on climate.
That takes me to Nikki. Your work tracks the nature impact of supply chains, especially deforestation. But let's be honest, even with good data, destruction continues. So how do we really get companies to change their behavior, especially since just a few traders are linked to most deforestation?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to go to hear, this is a global problem. We've heard the UK impacts, which are incredibly real, and global deforestation, which you mentioned. That's 11% of global climate emissions. It's a worldwide problem, but through supply chains, that impacts huge companies, financial institutions all over the world. So how do we solve the problem? Yes, the data is getting better. I mean, that's the $7 trillion question that Nicola posed. And, you know, it's worth saying that out of that 200 billion, I think the report that shows that 35 of that only is from the private sector. So there's a huge opportunity, but we need to see a lot more private sector action. Now, how are we going to go about solving this? I mean, where we started, maybe 10 years ago, focusing in on these problems was transparency. Geospatial data is so much better. We know the where now, pretty much, you know, and we keep getting more granular, but maybe we don't need to keep getting so much more granular. We need to answer questions like who? The who now, and what priority, the why, what do you do first? So we started, to give you a tangible example, maybe 10 years ago, an initiative called TRACE with the Stockholm Environment Institute, trying to revolutionize supply chain mapping at scale, looking at, you know, how commodities driving deforestation, where are we getting them from, what impact are they actually causing, who critically is handling them. So to give you an example, I mean, looking at beef trade from Brazil to China, beef is the world's biggest driver of deforestation and therefore a huge driver of climate change. China, a massive buyer. So we knew the volumes were big, but with TRACE now, we can show that, okay, there are 2,900 plus municipalities in Brazil which trade their beef with China. With TRACE data, we can now show that only 50% of the deforestation associated with the beef imports, half the deforestation, is linked to only 50 municipalities, and we can tell you which ones, and we can tell you who the traders involved are. So that's the kind of triage that a few years ago, that kind of information wasn't available. We just knew, oh, China, beef, you know, Brazil, problem, help, you know, panic. Whereas now we can say it's the 50, and you know, to me, there's a further problem which we need to address, which is, you know, why aren't all these insights being properly taken up? Because a lot of these, even triaged insights, are actually there. I mean, look, there's a lot more I could say to your question. We need. I mean, basically, maybe one other thing is to say that, you know, as the data gets better, the customer, from our perspective as a non-profit, is not only the companies and the financial institutions themselves, but also governments, because you can't regulate on these things unless you can then monitor. And because the data is better, then we can have initiatives like the EUDR, due diligence on deforestation, that the European Union has put in. That could be hugely powerful, but you can't have that kind of legislation unless you can see how much illegal or legal deforestation is coming into your jurisdiction. So, you know, there's a knock-on effect. We get better transparency, and then we get stronger laws, and hopefully a virtuous circle. Now, there's all kinds of issues there. I'm sure we'll dive into some of them. I'll stop there for now.
Yeah. Just before I jump into David, very quickly, how much do you rely on TNFD for your data?
Well, it's not so much data. I mean, we're an old friend with the TNFD, and we're one of the core partners, and, you know, it's just made a huge contribution. But David too stepped us a little bit back from data, first of all, to say it's about intelligence, it's about approaches, it's about framework. So from our perspective, looking at deforestation, one impact there, just one, in this hugely complex space. So land, incredibly important, oceans, incredibly important. You know, TNFD makes sense of all of that. It's a complex space. And what TNFD then does for groups like us is it anchors our work. It ties in, it's a universal framework. It's a start here kind of framework, and then ties it to the global biodiversity framework, ties it to ISSB, the accounting standards. That's in its early days, as David can tell us. It's familiar to businesses because it's like TCFD. It's been modeled the same way. So relevant, simple, rigorous, familiar, those are good things. So anchoring, it simplifies action. That's a second benefit we get from TNFD, because David alluded to, I think the LEAP process of the LEAP framework of TNFD. It's not just about disclosure, it's about managing the risk. How do you do that? Start stepwise, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we, with UNEP Finance Initiative and UNEP WCMC, have a tool called Encore, which hopefully many of you know about and use, and that helps with the sort of initial triage of saying, in the LEAP process, what are the parts, for a financial institution putting their portfolio into Encore as a first step, or as a national government, so Dutch Central Bank, ECB, lots of central banks have used our tool to say, where do I begin? How do I make sense of this universe? And they can say, okay, my dependencies and impacts on nature coalesce mainly in these 3 areas. Okay, let's land use. Let's go there, and then we dive in on deforestation. The final point on this is TNFD brings the audience to town. Huge uptake thanks to the leadership, ambassadorship of David and the amazing team there. Lots of uptake, virtuous circle. Then they come down to groups like ours, and we keep going and keep evolving. So thanks, TNFD.
Now, David, I want to jump into companies that are really not looking at nature and that are really shooting themselves in the foot by not doing that. And I think one good example is the supply chain of semiconductors. One thing that I didn't know is that chips depend on water to be created. And with no chips, with no water, there are no chips. And with no chips, we cannot build iPads, phones, vehicles, and basically any other electronic device. So can you elaborate a bit more on that example, and maybe another very useful example that we can all relate with?
Yeah, just to give you, before I answer that, an idea of how far we've come. So we have around 18 trillion of assets now adopting TNFD. It's about 25% of the investment universe. That's what TCFD achieved in about 7 years. So we've come in under 2 years what TCFD did in 7 years. And I think that shows the pace of which we're changing. But a real illustration is, would you expect a few years ago for Lloyds Bank to be on the stage here talking about soil and earthworms, right? They're now recognizing that soil quality, soil health is a material part of their banking book. And therefore we have to deal with it. But your question's a really good one, because what you learn about nature and nature dependency, a lot of people think, well, it's about farming and it's about food. And yes, it is about farming, it is about food, but actually nature dependencies cross every single industrial manufacturing process that we have. In fact, some of our biggest adopters of TNFD are in commercial real estate, they're in steel production, they're in transport, they're in heavy industries. Let's talk about the electronics industries. I was staggered the other day, a UK large technology firm, I won't name them, did their CSRD assessment, and they said nature risk was not material. Wow, right, so hold on. So you don't run any data centers that consume massive amounts of water. You're not using silicon chips in any way whatsoever. You're not getting rid of electronic waste and incinerating it that causes massive harm to the environment and all of the chemicals that are around there. And I think it's a good illustration of the extent that we are dependent on nature. Silicon chips, as you say, a large silicon chip manufacturer, take one in Taiwan, for example, will consume about 2 to 3 million liters of very clean water a year. Now, that is a massive dependency on an ecosystem service, clean water provision. That water runs out, you can't manufacture silicon chips. In fact, the US, that has been trying to onboard silicon chip manufacture to various states in the United States, has actually found they can't because they don't have enough water. So if you're an investor in this sector, like many of our TNFD members are, they start to look seriously at water provision. In fact, if you want to see a really good case example of an investor that has done this, Norges Investment Bank, one of our leading TNFD adopters, largest owner of public equities in the world. The first year of TNFD assessment, they used the Encore platform that Nikki's team have been responsible for creating. They recognized that the two most significant issues were land use change and water. And so year two, they've gone to their portfolio companies and they've asked every single one of them to start giving them insights and data on land use and water use, right? So a really good example of how the investment community is starting to take this seriously. The silicon chip firms, you know, if they run out of water, they can't produce, so what do? And this is where it gets interesting, because what they actually do is they start changing their industrial process. They start recycling the water, they start reusing it, they find ways of making it more efficient. And I think this is a really important point of this, which is, and I'll go back to what Nicola said, you know, she said 7 trillion of money is harming nature. And it's one of these big numbers, it's so big it kind of washes off you. It's like, well, what does that mean? And the reason she is correct is that nature harm isn't always visible. It's not always the deforestation or the cutting down of trees or the polluting a river. It's overuse of water. It's overuse of pollutants or fertilizers. The way to reduce that harm isn't just by replanting and preserving forests and trees, which is really important. It's reducing the amount of water you use. It's reducing the amount of chemicals you use. It's changing your processes. And I think this is why, you know, how can we invest in this space? How do we get financial returns? How do we make it material for investors as we start to build into our business practices those innovative technologies that reduce water, reduce chemicals, use regenerative farming, not the phosphate type approach we have, and start to get that 7 trillion down because we start reducing the harm. So I'll finish by saying, look, nature investing, we confuse it with bees and trees. Bees and trees are really important, but nature investing is also investing in technologies that reduce harm and change the practices that we rely on today, like silicon chip manufacture, that are literally using up the resources that we have at a pace that we can't sustain.
By the way, I want to remind you that there are 2 QR codes in here, which means that if you scan them, you can give us your own questions. So if you have any questions, I'll see it here in my iPad, and I can directly ask them. So while I wait for any of your questions, I will jump to Andrew. And based on what we were speaking here, is there any way that you're helping specifically farmers with all the programs that you're doing, optimize the natural resources so that they can better use them more efficiently, more productively?
Well, so yes, obviously the creation of the baseline data with the Soil Association Exchange has been the jumping off point. That's the most important. But to follow up with that, we're engaged in a number of pilots now, working with food groups, working with other bank groups to partner with farmers through the regenerative farming cycle. And I should give a shout out at this point to our friends at Rabobank in the Netherlands, who've been real leaders in this, very agriculture-focused bank in the Netherlands. They've shown the way through lots of partnership with other institutions, how you can potentially insure against the yield drop-off and the financial impact that farmers see in that transformation. So we're doing that. We're exploring third income streams. That's the other area that we should perhaps touch on, particularly as both businesses and government look at how biodiversity net gain solutions potentially could evolve into an effective marketplace, learning all the lessons that have gone before from largely the failure of the carbon marketplace. But I think in a number of areas that we're working with farmers on, they're the obvious delivery mechanism for nature-based solutions that could address a lot of issues. So if we can get the principles embedded, if we can all start to identify what the most potent and effective biodiversity net gain solutions could be for us in the UK, and I accept Nikki's point as well that the UK, like everywhere, has its own particular difficulties, then that we can make real progress. And farmers are really desperately looking for ways in which they can address the impacts not only on their own yields but also potentially to support wider development. You have, we're embedded in, insofar as we're the biggest lender to agriculture, we're also the biggest mortgage bank in the UK. We're the biggest lender to social house builders in the UK. We're working with government on their plan to build 1.5 million more houses in the UK. It's undeniable that the UK needs more homes. Either we deport lots of people or we have to find homes for them. We can't go on like we are. That has an obvious nature impact. It has to be addressed. It can't just be offset. And so working in an integrated way towards how farmers can play a role potentially with house builders to address that has to be the right thing to do in the long run. Again, it's quite a unique UK problem, but it's probably replicated in most of Western Europe, to be honest.
Nicole, I have a question here from the audience. So what initiatives or ideas are working to educate the $7 trillion misspent dollars on the importance of nature?
To educate?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question.
If there are any.
Yeah, well, I think there are a number of initiatives. I know Global Canopy does some brilliant work on firms in that area. TNFD through its working groups. But I think that, so if you look at the number of companies that are doing the most damage, so there was a study that was done by Finance for Biodiversity that looked across all global companies, and it looked at, there was 250 companies that are creating 3/4 of the damage. So actually, at a global scale, this is a pretty concentrated problem. So actually, I do think that education can be a really important part of this. And I think it is. I think there's a rhetoric problem often that it's a trade-off between nature, competitiveness, and growth. There is no trade-off. You cannot have growth that isn't based on natural capital. Our whole economies are dependent on natural capital. And so I think we need to change that whole narrative. And I think that providing the tools to do that is essential. And I want to, you've mentioned a few times this shooting yourself in the foot piece, which I think is really important. In my work, I don't talk a lot about birds and bees and butterflies. I talk about risk, economic and financial risk. Because this is a massive economic and financial risk. We all care about trees and birds and bees and butterflies, but this is fundamental to our economy. And it's fundamental in the UK. So, for example, we did work with a number of partners looking at the impact of nature loss in the UK. And we found that by 2030, we could have wiped off 5 years of growth from the UK. Nature and growth are not trade-offs. We find if you look at Brazil, so for example, deforestation in Brazil has an enormous impact on water supplies in Brazil. 80% of electricity in Brazil is hydropower. So that is, again, having a massive impact on their economy. So I think this is really critical, and that's what we need to educate the business community about and help see those opportunities that you can get revenues from this area.
And one important part, you just mentioned Brazil, for example. The countries that face the worst nature risks are generally the countries with fewer resources. So what is it needed to unlock investment there?
Yeah, and I might have, again, I'm from Oxford, so I have to challenge the premise of the question. I would say actually, all countries are at high risk, and one thing we find is that countries are very interconnected. So 50% of the risk we have here is imported from the rest of the world. But coming back to your question, so I think the biggest challenge for emerging and developing countries is they don't have the same capability to deal with it that we do. That we have no excuse here really. But how to mobilize finance into those economies and into nature is a big question at the moment. And I think there are huge opportunities there. So, coming back to one of the comments earlier, again, business plays a really important role. So in more nature positive business practices, regenerative agriculture, water conservation, all of these things do deliver revenues for business. So it's a win-win. But there are lots of other activities. So, for example, we do a lot of work on blended finance, which is looking at how can you bring public investment to leverage more private investment. So you can bring in around $7 of private investment for every $1 of public investment. So these types of mechanisms are really making a huge difference around the world. So I think overall it was estimated that over about the last 5 years, about $5 billion in investment has been brought in to nature through these new blended finance instruments. There's a lot of potential to scale those up.
Nikki, I want to jump with you. you've spoken before about urgent transformation, the need about this triage and transformation. So what would real change in the supply chain really look like?
It's a very good question. If I may, just very briefly to comment as well, I mean, one area we need education and input, an avenue for education is business schools. I mean, schools too, but business schools. You know, if you were still on a classical curriculum in so many business schools, and you know, that to me is unforgivable. And of course, there are some exceptions to that rule, but many who continue in that vein. On the supply chain question, I mean, look, supply chain opacity continues to be a problem. You know, it has been a problem. It is a problem now. We've made big strides in the data, but it's still a real issue, and it's also an excuse behind which many can hide, right? So we have to also recognize that we have really, really good data. And I want to mention, in response to your question, a perverse outcome risk. You know, if individual companies think about cleaning up their supply chains, and their supply chains alone, we'll potentially see consolidation of supply chains, fleeing to safer areas, leaving areas that need that inbound investment that we talked about to other less scrupulous financiers. Deforestation, or whatever the impact that we happen to be talking about, continues, and one company gets to say, hey, we reduced our supply chain impacts, but actually we don't get the outcomes that we want. So this is slippery, right? The opportunity, I think, is to push action down the supply chain in the way that many have said here, to help individual financially, in our case, getting back to that 7 trillion question. You know, we work with financiers to say, okay, the companies in your portfolio, those that you're most exposed to, let's take this deforestation problem. You know, what action, with the data that we gather, what action should they next take, and on what time frame? Let's make it really, really specific. The time for big commitments and promises is long gone. It's not even fashionable anymore. Let's get clarity on next actions. Let's have momentum. And that's the way that financial institutions can push change through the supply chains to have impact on the ground. And companies, bigger companies down the supply chain, manufacturers, can push it through their supply chain. So that's the direction that we're taking. And just very briefly, I mean, again, linked to all of this and picking up on the comments before, the kind of data that we have, I mentioned trace earlier, that pasture land, the cattle that is being reared in those municipalities that I talked about, that is going to Brazil, you know, degraded pasture land has environmental impacts, but also has yield impacts. We've got lower yields on that land. So with trace, we can now point to those places where investment from, you know, downstream investors, those who have exposure, would help environmentally, but would also raise yields, increase therefore cash flows, and then we're off again to this point that these two things, the environment and the economy, are self-evidently not mutually exclusive.
David, I want to jump with you. Any further thoughts in this, very briefly?
Well, I think just building on Nicola's point and your question on how do you finance countries that are rich in natural resource but poorer in financial resource. There are more financial instruments, debt for nature swaps, green bonds, been around for a long time now, biodiversity credits, where many of us were involved in starting to create what I would call a nascent but growing appetite for financial products that can help finance these areas. But just going back to Nikki and what Andrew said, let's not think that, you know, the supply chain risk and the nature risk is all in Brazil or in the Congo or in Southeast Asia. It's in UK farms. Our soil quality has been degraded. We've got the climate change that's happening. I mean, Andrew made a pretty sobering statement that their farmers are going out of business. It's a third of their book of business. And this is why asset managers who invest in people like Lloyds Bank, who invest for our pensions and others, are starting to really take this seriously and starting to ask, where is this nature risk sitting? To Nikki's point about business schools, I was an exec fellow at London Business School for a while, and I shared the frustration, which is we teach traditional P&L and accounting, and I think if there's a group that we do need to educate, it's CFOs, because they look at balance sheets every day nature risk is on the balance sheet. It's there. You just heard it from Andrew, and yet it doesn't sit in the figures. So how do we start building nature risk into our financial figures so we understand where it sits? I think TNFD is a tool by going through a methodology, by going through a defined process that starts to help finances put nature risk on the balance sheet. And once that happens, you start making the right decisions about where to allocate capital and where to do it. So I think it's, the progress is fast, but we need to move quickly because we're running out of time. We're really running out of time, and we're starting to see nature risk occur all over the place in a way that is material to our pensions, our investments, not least the natural environment that we depend upon. So we have to do it quickly.
So we only have 4 minutes left, so I want to ask all of you the last question here. What's the very first thing we must act on now to protect nature and business? We can start with Nicola.
Well, I would come back to this changing the narrative piece. I think that the reason why we're in this situation that we're in is, as David said, so we don't take account of nature when we make decisions. It's there. But we don't account for it. So I think it's that putting it in financial decision making of government, of businesses, so we're recognizing that value that we're getting from nature and the impact that we're having on nature. If we can value that appropriately and build that into our accounting frameworks, our actuarial frameworks, our fiscal risk management frameworks, our financial regulation, then I think that will filter through and make a very big difference.
Andrew?
I think I would build on that to say we need to stop treating the progress on nature as behind that of climate. They have to come into alignment now. TNFD has got us all organized. We've got enough data to get started. As we come towards the action plans and the NDCs being submitted under the Paris Agreement, they have to come together as one. Nature and climate have to go together now because we need to align finance to deliver that. So enough with the nature's catching up with carbon discussion. Let's start talking about them together as one.
Nikki?
Well, look, I'm going to cheat a bit to comment. I mean, they're two sides of the same coin. And let's remember that the greatest risk to nature is climate, is rising temperatures, and then we might see a tipping point in the Amazon. So it works both ways. Let's not forget that. And we're all we need to join the two. On my priority, what's the priority? I think I said it before, momentum. I mean, let's see momentum. Let's see action. That feels good. Let's get something done and then do the next thing. And the way we think about things today at Global Canopy, we've been working on transition all this time, but we need triage, we need transition, and we definitely need transformation. We need creativity. We need to think a bit more radically, all at the same time. So pick one of those areas, do something.
I mean, I will ask you to remember some of the really great points Nicola, Andrew, and Nikki have made. It's not a trade-off with business versus nature. There's material risk in our portfolios. There's a lot of money being spent on things that do harm that we can reduce, and we should start moving. I think the thing I would end on with is where we started. And being a data person like myself, you may be surprised by me saying this, but do not be seduced by the idea that data is the problem. Inaction is the problem. There is enough data out there. It's getting better every day. There's incredible innovation. But allowing ourselves to think that I will use data as an excuse, or supply chain intransparency as an excuse, or complexity as an excuse is not acceptable. We do have to start. We can start. The thousands of TNFD adopters and people who are using the framework have actually found it pretty intuitive, and they've all said, once you start, it starts to become actually pretty obvious where the risk is. And we shouldn't let ourselves sort of hide behind this idea, it's too complex or there's not enough data, blah, blah, blah. Don't be seduced by that. Just start actually learning and building that knowledge that we need.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have ended right on time. Thank you to all our speakers here for such insightful comments.